Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, get your stuff out of here right now, screamed our belligerent landlord, his mean lips turned downwards into a nasty scowl. You both need to leave right now. I'll give you 5 more minutes, and that's being really good to you. But if you haven't evacuated your stuff and left the premises by then, I'll be calling the cops on you. Do you understand? I nodded. My sister and I scrambled quickly through the Seattle apartment, grabbing everything that we could fit into the car and stuffing it swiftly into large black bin liners, which we squeezed tightly into the trunk of my red SUV. I knew that there was no reasoning with Mr. Barker, who refused to listen to our desperate pleas or even consider negotiating with me. I tried to tell him that we could sell our television, refrigerator and other large items of value online to extract next month's rent. It had been a losing battle, and in the end he'd gained all our sizable items anyway. Not, of course, through any choice of our own, but because we couldn't afford any removal or storage costs. It was too late for all that bargaining now. The hourglass had released its final grains of sand, and the time was well and truly up for us, and we needed to be out of here now. Mr. Barker's stern face was unflinching, as he refused to listen to us, looking upon us with about as much sympathy as an owl might have over a nightly mouse he'd grabbed with his talons for an enjoyable snack. No empathy at all, that means. My sister and I have nowhere to go, Mr. Barker, if you kick us out. We'll do anything, I pleaded. I'll work for you. I'll tidy up all these apartments, clean all the toilets, do the dirty, mucky, disgusting jobs that nobody wants to do. But please, I begged, don't throw us out like this. Surely we can come to some kind of arrangement, make a plan. I'll try and find another job as soon as I can, and I'll pay you every last penny with interest. I promise. I really do. I'm not in the business of handing out preferential treatment to any of my tenants, let alone you. And I'm not about to start bending the rules now, not for anyone. I also have a living to make, you know, and a family to feed. We're all in the same boat. It's survival of the fittest in this dog-eat-dog world, he piped. Lovely, I thought. He really does have a good overview of humanity. Luckily, we're not all like him. Where to? I asked my sister, as we sat in our SUV, staring vacantly at the road ahead of us, our trunk loaded with all our worldly possessions, everything we owned in the world. We were now driving down the road that led to nowhere, as that is exactly where we were going. Nowhere. The routinely bustling streets of the Emerald City of Seattle, with the masterful, prominent high-rise buildings towering up into the skies, some modern, others classical, seemed unusually quiet on this pretty spring morning. Even the long streets lined with shops, restaurants, boutiques, and so much more, normally thronging with people, seemed empty and devoid of activity. The busy coffee shops, traditionally buzzing with locals picking up their morning latte, were more subdued and quieter than usual. I discerned a lone jogger running down the streets, where there was now only a scattering of cars parked in the lot. I noticed a dog walker on the sidewalk, walking his 2 large labradoodles. There was only a few people scuttling around like frightened rabbits, all wearing masks and terrified of catching the deadly virus. It would seem that Seattle, like so many cities around the globe, had become like a ghost town. Even the news media was pumping out figures every day, scary figures, just like the petrol at a gas pump, of those they claimed had lost their lives to this dreadful pandemic. Were they trying to fearmonger us, I wondered, or was it really as bad as they claimed? I wasn't sure either way. It seemed that everyone was running around scared, and washing one's hands vigilantly had become the order of the day. I'd seen one man on television so terrified of catching the virus that he hosed down his entire family with an ice-cold hose when they returned from town. I could see his poor son look less than thrilled to be ambushed by the powerful hosepipe. Boy, was I glad not to be a member of his family. Then I heard of a woman who stripped naked before she even entered her house, and her own dog failed to recognize her without clothes on, chasing her around the yard, yapping loudly, arousing all the neighbours' attention. It seemed almost her entire neighbourhood was alerted to the poor woman darting around, completely starkers. I gather she chose to leave her clothes in the sun for a couple of days so that the UV light could finally kill the virus. I had learnt that the food banks had been busy doling out foods to families, and I sincerely hoped that my sister and I would not be joining those queues. But at this stage of the game, I couldn't be certain of anything. I was now obliged to receive state benefits, something I had prided myself in never having to resort to. But like so many now wearing my shoes, needs must, and you simply have to do what you have to do, even if there is a tail between your legs in the process. I knew my sister and I needed to live in our car, as choice did not even enter the equation, for we had none. I tried to reassure myself that we were so much better off than those sleeping rough on the streets of Seattle, in the King County area. I knew that that was indeed true, but despite everything, it didn't bring me even a small measure of reassurance. It was pitiful, sad, and ridiculous, as I knew that there were so many hard-working Americans who were down on their luck like we were, and did not deserve the cruel trials and tribulations that lockdowns invariably brought to the American economy, let alone the depression, the isolation and loneliness that, in my opinion, could potentially take out more lives than the virus itself. 2 months ago, things had been remarkably different. I had a fabulous job in the city as an assistant manager for a small, illustrious boutique, where I earned a sizable wage. But now, like so many, I had been laid off, as the small business could not afford more than 1 permanent member of staff, as times were tough, very tough indeed. "I'm so sorry," my manager Kirsten had said to me, her kind eyes brimming with tears. "There's no way to say this, Helen, but I just can't afford to keep you on. I so wish I could. Well, not in the current climate, that is, but when things get better, that's if they do get better, your job is open for you any time. That's if my business is still open." Of course I understood. How could I not? Kirsten didn't have a choice in the matter but to let me go. She was in the impossible, unfeasible position of so many other small businesses like herself, all in her predicament, forced to throw out their excess staff through no choice of their own. I was terrified her business was going to fold and that she would ultimately lose everything. It had happened to so many, and the small businesses had been hit the hardest. It was bitterly unfair. Never in my life had I suddenly felt so alone, so impotent, feeble, helpless, and completely lost. Worse still, I had my little sister Janice to look after. How were we going to manage without a roof over our heads for months at a time? Until I could possibly find a job, if I could find one at all. Of course, I knew the answer to that question. As I said before, living in our car was our only option. I was beginning to wish that over the years I had not been filling up my landlord's fat pockets with hard-earned cash. I felt resentful of making someone else rich, especially Mr. Barker, at my expense. My sister and I would have been far better off if the money had been used to buy a decent RV, as now we were crying over spilt milk. But the benefit of hindsight does have a cruel way of increasing the blow and punching you hardest in the guts, where it really, really hurts. But je ne sais quoi, as they say in French, such is life. We had no one to turn to for help, no relatives to call on in times of desperate need, who could potentially give us board and lodgings for a while. Regretfully, both of our parents were long since deceased, as they had died from a drink-driving accident 5 years prior. It was one of those dreadful unforeseen accidents of being at the wrong place at the wrong time, bad luck. It would seem a lone drunkard behind the wheel of a truck drove directly into my parents' car on the wrong side of the road, and there were no survivors in that fatal crash. I didn't want to be meditating over that now, as I had enough to worry about. Looking after my little sister Janice was my prerequisite in life, and she was all I had in the world. Even the insurance money from my parents' death had all been stolen by our investor, so every way you looked at it, life had not been easy. But I'd refused to allow it to get me down or discourage me. I mean, what would have been the point of that? If you had told me over a year ago that I would be jobless and living in my car with my 12-year-old sister Janice, and that there would be a global pandemic that required us to social distance, wear masks, isolate ourselves, work from home and remain in lockdown, I would never have believed it even remotely possible. In fact, I'm almost sure I would have been so rude and laughed in your face and said that such an idea was nonsensical and preposterous, and stuff like that could never happen in our lives. But it did. It happened. It is something in later years we will share with our great-grandchildren, and we will tell them all about what it was like to live in the dark days of a global pandemic. And I'm sure they will look on us with admiring eyes for having the courage to face such adversity. It would seem that this treacherous, vindictive virus appeared at first to be like a storm that was brewing over the horizon, boiling over like a cauldron of soup, until dark, looming thunderclouds emerged across the sky, disarmed by the threatening, jagged yellow flashes of lightning, accompanied by the violent booms of thunder that enveloped our world in a short space of time. In my humble opinion, that was indeed how fast and furious the virus had broken through our lives, and one thing was certain: things would never ever be quite the same again. There certainly was not a soul on the globe not impacted by this virus in some way. For many tears had been shed, lives had been lost, jobs had been forfeited, and worse still, people's hearts had been broken. And many like me felt helpless, useless, redundant, and completely worthless, which is crazy, because we weren't any of those things. "What are you going to do?" asked my sister. I could see the fear rising up in her eyes like the high waves of an ocean. I knew she was frightened. So was I, actually. I was responsible for her charge, and I felt like a complete failure, almost like I'd really let her down. I could feel the regret, the doubt, the horror, the dread of the days, months, and weeks that lay ahead of us, yet I knew that the art of survival was getting through one day at a time. It is astoundingly prodigious how we learn to adjust as human beings to tough, grueling situations. It's never easy, of course, but we have more resilience, stoicism, and spiritedness than we give ourselves credit for. Before long, my sister Janice and I settled into the daily routine of everyday life. The hard, punishing, taxing part was finding somewhere safe to park every day, where we wouldn't be asked to leave by police or even local residents. Who could blame them? As I wouldn't want dossers loitering around my area either, if the boot was on the other foot, that is. It is laboriously challenging living out of a car and trying to stay clean. Every morning my sister and I would find a washroom at a local gas station where we would sterilise the sink first and then sponge ourselves down. We dropped off our washing at a lady's home who was happy to accept payment for washing all our clothes. It seemed like a great deal. It was uncomfortable spending long nights tossing and turning in the car. There's not a part of your body that doesn't ache from shifting around in the front seat and sleeping in all those awkward positions. It rather reminds me of sleeping in economy class on a tight, very confined and narrow seat on one of those long-haul overseas flights. To make matters infinitely more worse, it gets sticky, muggy and very uncomfortable in the car during the excruciatingly hot months of summer. And then during the winter, it can be freezing cold and almost unbearable. I despised the fact that my sister and I were living on cheap grub, as fast food is a whole lot cheaper and more accessible than healthy options. I certainly regretted that we weren't partaking in our healthy home-cooked meals anymore. Still, beggars can't be choosers, and we were in no position to complain. We had a lot to be positive about. Every day we would park our car and go for walks to keep ourselves in a more positive, upbeat frame of mind, as it's all too easy to spiral into a deep depression. There were moments when I was too numb to actually cry, but the pain was very real and raw. And yes, I did feel fragile and vulnerable, but I knew I had to hold it together, with all the strength that I could muster, for Janice's sake, of course. I certainly couldn't allow her to see the level of angst I was experiencing. That would have been very upsetting for her. One night my sister and I found a quiet spot to park our car. Well, we thought it was quiet. We both fell asleep on the front seats to be awoken by a violent thug slamming our car windows and demanding for us to let him in. "Let me in," he screamed. "Let me in." He looked like he was high on opiates or drunk, or maybe both. I couldn't decide which. I could see his glazed eyes rolled back in their sockets. He looked like a ghostly white zombie with the dark black circles that framed the contours of his eyes, reminding me of a scene out of the apocalypse. I had pressed the pedal down on my accelerator and raced out of there at lightning speed, and my sister and I took quite a while to finally calm down, for the experience had certainly left us rattled. The following day I decided to drive a couple of hours away from Seattle, down the backcountry roads to a destination in close proximity to the Cascades National Park, an area of rugged wilderness, magnificent mountains, sculptural outcrops, and acres of resplendent forests filled with hemlocks, pines, firs and cedar trees, along with pretty blue lakes that in certain lights look almost aquamarine. It was on this spontaneous road trip that I found the quintessential perfect spot to park my SUV that could not be observed from the road and was behind a few trees that fringed a wooded area and some thick underbrush. I felt absolutely certain that our car would never be observed from the open road. I immediately felt my mood edified and inspired as we ambled through this lush wooded area, consisting of tall statuesque trees, pretty lacy ferns, violets, bluebells, wild ginger, soft mosses. It was so intoxicatingly beautiful. It quite literally took my breath away. So much so that I almost abandoned the burdensome weight or toilsome backpack of my troubles. Janice and I, with gladdened hearts, laughed jubilantly as we bounded like bunny rabbits across a pretty flowering meadow, bursting with a prismatic display of glorious colours. We trekked through a wooded area that rose up on a high, mountainous, precipitous elevation that we climbed ambitiously. We mastered the high incline and reached a flat clearing. We could cherish and admire the bedazzling beauty of the valley below, where the lake shimmered and gleamed with the prisms of sunlight dancing off the water in a reflectant golden hue. It certainly twinkled like a vibrant turquoise jewel. It was hunger and healthy appetites that finally guided us back to our car to collect our sandwiches, which we enjoyed eating by the pristine lake. We were so caught up in the pleasures of our day that we barely took stock of the time. Finally, the long day retreated behind us, while the golden sun set over the horizon, glazing the vast sky in a kaleidoscope of tangerines. It was almost like an artist had painted the sky in a glorious array of opulent, rich, vibrant, orangey colours. Janice and I sat up against a couple of rocks that we used as backrests and stared in awe at this ravishing scene. I felt better than I had in days, as the inspiration that I'd drawn from nature, like a delicious milkshake from a straw, where the sweet taste of the natural world had blown away the cobwebs of doubt and fear, replacing them with a more optimistic outlook, but not for long, as things were going to get a lot worse before they got better. As the sunset folded away, the night sky deepened and darkened. At first it appeared a dusky and grey colour, and then an inky blackness enveloped it with a profound unfriendliness, a stark contrast from the inviting, cheerful warmth of the day. It would seem that the stars and moon had taken the night off, as their glittery display was very meagre, and at best rather negligible. You would think that the chirps of the crickets and the croaks of the frogs would offer us a measure of consolation, but not so. I sensed something was off on this night, but I couldn't decide what it was. I had not actually fully appreciated the solitude and isolation of being camped out in our car all on our own, on the outer perimeters and borders of the forest. There was something to be said about safety in numbers, but being alone on an illusory night, where phantom-like outer-worldly shadows moved through the trees, was not something that I had foreseen or anticipated. My sister looked at me with round, scared eyes. "It's so dark outside," she said. "Really, really dark. The forest seems so hauntingly sinister. I feel as if we're not alone in this dark void, as if something really terrifying is out there in those trees, and it's watching us. I really feel that, don't you?" "Don't be ridiculous," I assured my sister, disguising the lack of confidence I really was feeling by appearing indifferent and nonchalant. "It's just dark out there, silly," I teased. "It's nothing to be afraid of, really. It's a poor showing of stars tonight, with virtually no moon, which makes everything so much more oppressive and menacing. You're also possibly just seeing things in your head that aren't actually there. The imagination is very good like that." "I don't think you're right," she said. "I feel as if something is really off. I get the impression that something is watching us, and we're not alone." After reassuring my sister that everything was absolutely fine, and that indeed her imagination was deceiving her, finally we managed to get some shut-eye. I was suddenly awoken by Janice, who was shaking me vigorously. "I need to relieve myself," she said. "I'm not going out there on my own." "Right," I said, "I'm coming with you now." We both put on our headlamps and ventured out into the woods. All of a sudden we saw a magnificent red fox cross our path. He was very stunning. My sister forgot her need to relieve herself, running after the red fox with an enthusiastic gusto. Why she actually did this, I don't know, but she's always been passionate about red foxes. "A red fox!" she cried out in delight, running after the creature. It was really rather peculiar, because the fox was not unsettled by my sister following it, but appeared frenzied and worried about something else as it glanced over its shoulders, as if something else was potentially coming. That was when I noticed that the sounds of the crickets and frogs had all but faded. The forest seemed to have grown ominously quiet, and all I could see was the dark, menacing, shadowy silhouettes of the trees quivering like tall, frightened people. For every branch began to shiver and shake like a wobbly, unstable bar table. Worse still, there was a nasty chill in the air, which was very unusual for spring. But it was as if the temperature had plummeted quite considerably, and an odorous smell seemed to waft in the atmosphere, permeating it with a sickly, sweet, acetone-like stench that smelt exactly like death and decay. The spectral darkness clung to me like a heavy cloak that weighed me down with a dense claustrophobia, almost as if the whole forest was encroaching in on me and on my personal space, rather like a circle of predators. My heart began to race while my mind lost its focus and became foggy, clouded and blurry. And my heart began to pound through my chest. Something was very wrong. I could sense it in my gut. "Come back, Janice! Janice! Janice!" I cried after my sister, who had long since gone, as her focus was clearly on chasing the fox. Damn, I thought, where on earth had she got to? I'd have to venture deeper into the grove to find her, and everything was beginning to intimidate me, as even the branches of the trees seemed to morph into sinister, gruesome-looking tentacles, while the whistling wind and the rustling leaves, along with the distant wails of a wolf, only added to my neurosis. "Come back!" I cried, but I was met with a still, airy silence. Then all of a sudden, thundering through the dark, dense, shadowy forest at lightning speed, like a bad-tempered charging rhino in the thicket, came a booming, blasting, and ear-piercing sound that was so terrifying it sent chills racing down my spine. Whatever this thing was, it was titanic in size. It was monstrously huge. It was running towards me. Every powerful thud from the hefty footfall caused the whole ground to vibrate and rumble. I could hear branches shaking and tree limbs breaking and snapping, as if this ghastly, ghastly thing, was destroying everything in its wake, like a powerful Herculean-sized bulldozer. I'd never seen anything like it before. "Something is coming," I screamed. "Something is coming! Oh, Janice, it's going to kill us! It's going to kill us! Go back to the car! Wherever you are, Janice, go to the car! Go back to the car now! Janice, did you hear me? Janice!" I screamed. I began to run through the forest, back towards my SUV, breathing desperately hard, inwardly praying that Janice would do the same. Now all we could do was to save ourselves. Whatever was coming towards me was dangerous, and I instinctively knew that. I felt it, I tasted it, I sensed it in every fibre of my being. And yes, you can taste danger. It's a sickly, bitter taste that rises up in the back of your throat, causing you to gag in disgust. I realised instinctively that I was being hunted. I could hear the hefty feet heaving behind me, and the heavy breathing and grunting. I knew whatever this thing was, it had to be enormous. So why did I turn around to look at him? Why did I glance back over my shoulders? It was a mistake, a monumental mistake, a grievous mistake. A mistake I would surely live to regret. But I couldn't help myself. I looked. My running slowed to a stop as I froze to the spot, incapacitated by my terror and great trepidation. I gawked in horror at what I was beholding. This dark, shadowy creature got caught up in the light of my head torch. Its dark silhouette took form, and I discerned a monstrous ape-like being, covered in long, flowing, pitch-black hair, darker than the darkest night. It towered at 10 feet tall, 1,000 pounds, and possibly 4 feet wide across the chest. This creature was a giant. It was a monster. Oh, my God! It was a Bigfoot. I realised this in astonishment. The shock of this revelation began to shake me to the core. It was a monster of all monsters, a beast of all beasts, for it was surely made from the dense, dark fabric of my very worst nightmares. Could this even be real? The adrenaline pumped through my veins, giving me energy that I never knew I had. A large boulder came flying through the trees, missing the Bigfoot by inches, and that was enough to distract him, to give me a few more crucial life-saving seconds to get back to my car. I raced back to my SUV, tearing open the door and diving into the driver's seat. Now the creature was there, seconds away from me, thumping and banging violently at my door. I revved up the engine, pressed down the accelerator, and drove away, horrified to see the creature was running alongside my car, its eyes gawking in at me through the window, while it began to bellow and scream. And the noise it made was so terrifying that I thought my heart was going to fail. I increased the speed and got out of that area as fast as I possibly could, my body shaking like a jelly, and my eyes flooding with tears. How long I sat in my car trembling and crying, I do not know. It was a long time. I was certain I had come close to death. If that mysterious stone had not come flying through the trees to provide a distraction for the creature, I knew I would almost certainly be dead. I could only hope that Janice would be all right, but I am afraid I had a sinking, crushing feeling weighing down in my heart that she was already a goner, unless she had managed to get away. I daren't go back, not with that thing out there, I thought. I knew I needed to wait for morning. Everything felt safe in the morning. I was certain it was over for Janice. Perhaps I should have called someone, the police, Fish and Game, but I decided against it, because my crippling fear was too afraid of what I might find, and that avoidance and delay felt like the best strategies, which in hindsight was very foolish on my part. I think I was just in such a state I couldn't think clearly. So it was with bated breath I returned to the scene of the terrifying incident the following morning, with a thick lump in the back of my throat. I parked my car on the side of the road, and imagine my surprise when Janice came bolting through the undergrowth towards me with a big smile on her face. I cradled her in my arms. "You're alive," I gasped. "I thought you were dead. I thought I'd lost you. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know who to call. I was so scared." "I did hear you crying to run to the car, but when I saw that awful thing chasing you and your car was driving away, I knew I needed a safe refuge before that thing came back. So I climbed up a large oak tree. I've never been good at climbing trees, but I managed to climb it, and my adrenaline gave me superhuman strength. The creature ran past me under the tree, gliding into the woods, and was gone. I don't even think he knew I was up there. I could see he seemed very angry. I climbed down the tree this morning and waited for you. I knew you'd be coming back." All that happened last year, when for 6 months I lived in a car with my sister Janice, but I found a new job working with an old friend of mine, and so I'm currently house sharing with her. To all of you out there suffering in this global pandemic, remember, keep your pecker up. Eventually a storm will blow over. It always has to. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners. Howard, I said, shaking my son vigorously. "Stop being such a lazy bum, will you? Wake up! It's already 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Are you going to sleep all day?" My son ignored me, emitting a low groan. "Oh, leave me alone, Mum," he said, throwing the pillow over his head to block out my nagging voice. "I'm trying to get some sleep." I glanced around his bedroom. It was a complete pigsty, with a couple of takeaway pizza boxes strewn across the floor haphazardly, and several empty bottles of finished cereal piled on top of each other. And then there were coffee mugs lying scattered everywhere, on every available surface, from the large mahogany corner desk and both of his side tables. What a complete tip! It certainly didn't help that my son's dirty clothes were strewn across the floor like unwanted pieces of jumble, and they hadn't even managed to make the 4-foot marathon journey all the way to the laundry basket. "The lazy sod," I thought resentfully. I felt an indignant anger coursing through my veins, causing my skin to flush with heat. I tried to reason with myself sensibly. He's a teenager, for goodness sake. Don't be so hard on him. This is how teenagers behave. It's all about the hormones. They're all over the place. Well, that's what I'd been told by countless other mothers from my son's school, all who were dealing with the trials and tribulations of raising teenagers. In truth, I never fully appreciated quite how turbulent and rocky the road would invariably become when my son turned 16, as no one warns you about this. It didn't help that I was a single mum, a divorcee raising my child all on my own, while my son visited his father in Hawaii for only 3 weeks once a year. I was secretly relieved that I only had one son, as I didn't know how I would have coped with more than one child. I would have probably been tearing my hair out by now. After Howard was born, I felt rather guilty that he didn't have a brother, but after receiving a radical hysterectomy, brother or sister for Howard wasn't even an option for me, as the choice had been snatched away by the hands of fate. In a strange way, I was rather thankful for small mercies, as managing more than one teenager didn't even bear thinking about. I had noticed that raising Howard had turned my hazel brown hair completely grey, and I was in my early 30s, for goodness sake, and I was now having to dye my hair a dirty blonde colour. Don't get me wrong, I loved Howard more than anything else in the entire world, but his personality was as vacillating and fluctuating like the 4 seasons in a day, and he could go from being bright and sunny to stormy with dark thunderclouds and lightning strikes in almost a matter of seconds. Any mother of teenage children would completely identify with exactly what I'm talking about. Instinctively I gathered his higgledy-piggledy laundry that was tossed so carelessly across the cream carpet into a neat tidy bundle in my hands, trotting down our sweeping staircase until I entered the laundry room, where I quickly piled the rolled-up clothes into the large hollow drum. I was just about to switch on the washing machine when I heard a familiar bleeping sound coming from inside the drum. It was my son's cell phone that I'd so nearly put on the wash cycle. I was horrified, as I knew Howard was attached to his tiny tablet. I knew that I would never see the end of it if I ruined one of his very best friends, his mobile phone. It was hard to assimilate that this tiny piece of metal dictated his entire life, as in any waking moment he was constantly tapping away at it, sending his friends all kinds of text messages. It was hard to fathom that when I was a young girl, no one even owned a cell phone, and yet we managed perfectly fine in those days. But now, if you don't have a cell phone, it was equivalent to being seriously handicapped and impeded physically. I found the offending article tucked in the back pocket of the dark trousers that he'd worn yesterday. I knew he could not have been out last night, as he had a great deal of studying to do, and he had promised me he would apply himself. So what was his cell phone doing in his back trouser pocket, and not doing sitting beside his bed on the side table, which was its usual resting place, unless he was out on the town last night and had surreptitiously snuck out of the house without my knowledge. I wouldn't put anything past him. I'm not by nature a prying or inquisitive person, but I am a concerned mother. Something about my son's cell phone being in the back pocket of his trousers seized my attention, and I had a sneaky suspicion that he had been out last night. It was an ominous feeling that I couldn't shake off, like an irritating bee buzzing around you when you're drinking a sweet drink. I studied the phone and saw there was a message on the screen, and for some reason I could not stop myself from reading it. So I guess that probably makes me moderately nosy. The message read, "Howie, how did last night go for you and Phil? Did you manage to hide in his barn? Did you see him? I told you he's a complete weirdo. I hope he didn't catch you creeping around his property. You were careful not to be seen, weren't you? I told you I wasn't making any of this up. Please let me know what the heck happened. I'm worried you were caught, because you're not answering your phone to me, and neither has Phil. I've phoned you both 8 times already this morning. Please phone me back ASAP." My heart sank when I read the message. What was Howard up to? He knew very well that he was not permitted to go out last night in the wake of his upcoming exams. It seemed to me that he'd been stealthily sneaking around on somebody else's property. This revelation concerned me greatly. What was he doing? I could once again feel a frustrated angst rising up in my chest. I seriously wanted to throttle him. I really did. I stormed up the stairs, carrying a vengeful icy-cold glass of water in one hand and my son's mobile phone in the other. I wanted answers, and I wanted them now, I thought indignantly. My son had some serious explaining to do. Howard, I said, wake up now, wake up. I shook the bunched-up mound under the duvet cover more forcefully than before. Once again my son moaned. "Leave me alone, Mum," he protested in a piqued tone. "I told you I want to sleep," he grumbled, grabbing the pillow to cover his head yet again. I tugged the pillow away from him and threw the icy-cold water over his face. Howard let out a belligerent cry and jumped up from his sleeping position like a jack-in-the-box, wearing a startled expression on his face. "Mum, what the heck are you doing? What did you do that for?" he screamed. "Look what you've done! I'm sopping wet. My hair and my face are soaked." He began to dry his face begrudgingly with a hand towel. "That was seriously mean, Mum. I was trying to get some sleep." "Not any more, you aren't," I piped. "I want answers, Howard. I want them right now. What were you doing sneaking out of the house last night and skulking around in someone's barn? Now that is what I want to know." My son sat up, with a befuddled expression on his face, and his horrified eyes grew as wide as saucers, and his now ashen face became as white as a sheet. "How do you know about that, Mum?" he trembled. Who told you? It didn't mean anything. It was only a bit of fun." "Only a bit of fun," I said. "Only a bit of fun." "Howard, you're not supposed to leave this house. I told you not to. And what were you doing? You were supposed to be studying for your upcoming exams, or have you forgotten that? Furthermore, you can't go trespassing onto strangers' properties in the middle of the night. This is not acceptable behaviour at all. It's a criminal offence. It's called trespassing. You didn't take anything, did you? Of course not, Mum. I'm not a thief. Well, what were you doing then? My son groaned when he saw me clutching his cell phone, so he knew better than to lie to me about his nocturnal activities the previous night. I assume he realised I'd read all of his texts. I noticed he was trembling anxiously. "All right, Mum, I'll tell you everything," he said, in a resigned voice, surrendering to his fate like a beaver caught up in a trap. "Get dressed now," I said. "Tidy this room up, and after you've eaten your belated lunch, then you can tell me everything. Is that a deal? From the very beginning, mind you, and I don't want you leaving anything out. I need all the details." "Deal," said my son, letting out a heavy sigh, knowing only too well that he would not escape without telling me everything. And the one good thing about Howard was he was a very bad liar, so withholding the truth from me would be as challenging as eating shellfish for him. He just couldn't do it. I returned to my kitchen to prepare a quick lunch for Howard, opening the refrigerator and gathering a bowl of cold Jersey potatoes, which I sliced quickly, whilst I whisked up some eggs with Parmesan cheese to make Howard a Spanish potato omelette, which I placed on the gas griddle to brown. I glanced over the frying pan through the sliding glass doors of my open-plan kitchen that opened out to a large wraparound porch. I could not help but survey the bedazzling landscape that lay beyond the kitchen. I had to admit that the panoramic views overlooking our backyard were utterly spectacular, especially at this vibrant time of the year, when the trees were ablaze with the flamboyant colours from golds to yellows, reds and oranges. Then there were the towering statuesque Smoky Mountains in the far distance, forming a hazy, purple, almost cloudy silhouette against the azure blue sky, while the contrasting close-up emerald green turf, scattered with clusters of trees, was exceedingly beguiling. I was glad that the grass had not yet turned yellow. Such an exquisitely beautiful day, I mused to myself, that could potentially be cruelly blighted or tainted like a black blotch on the landscape. That was, of course, when Howard finally released the cat out of the bag and told me what was going on. I was not sure I wanted to hear his excuses, protestations and warped irrational reasons for poking around somebody else's barn during the night. All kinds of horrifying thoughts whirled around and around in my head like a Ferris wheel on a children's playground. It could have been worse. Far worse, I reassured myself. He could have actually broken into someone's house. At least it was only a barn, which wasn't quite as bad. But for some reason that thought brought me little comfort. In truth, it changed nothing. Absolutely nothing. My son was still guilty of loitering around someone's barn in the middle of the night. I felt woefully ashamed, bashful, embarrassed even. I tried to extinguish what he was going to tell me by drawing a curtain around my mind like the nurses do around a hospital bed. But the proverbial reminders of my son's transgressions badgered my mind like a woodpecker pounding away at a tree, tirelessly with its beak. Procrastination, wrapped up in a quintessential package of distraction, were the ideal tools to help me stop thinking about Howard. I turned my attention to focus on the weather. Summer was drawing to a close, and so I'd eagerly grabbed each warm day, as if it was my last, with a passionate appreciation and zealousness. In a trice the temperatures would drop significantly. There were early signs that autumn was making an early appearance this year. Some of the trees had already shed their leaves, but the red maples in our yard clung on to their leaves, proud of their glorious ensemble of magnificent red-orange leaves that looked like sparkling rubies in the noonday sun, especially the way the flecks of light bounced off the leaves in a reflectant golden blaze. I wallowed in the sunshine with a hungry appetite, like a crocodile sunning himself on a sun-kissed rock, as the pleasurable radiant beam swept through the kitchen, enkindling it in a blissful warm light. It was such a waste to sleep away the daylight hours in a bed, I thought, like my son did, but I was to learn that all teenagers were exactly the same the world over, and sleeping in late went with the territory of being young and carefree. It was so splendid outside. This marvellous weather was not going to last for very much longer. I could already sense the presence of winter loitering around the next corner, like a snow leopard ready to pounce on us with her icy cold presence. As you can expect, like any hungry teenager, Howard finally wolfed down all his potato omelette, which was shortly followed by almost a gallon of ice cream, and then he finally told me that he was ready to talk. I don't quite know if I was ready to listen. I discerned my son seemed rather nervous. His fingers twitched awkwardly, and his eyes appeared somewhat troubled and perturbed. I noticed he was deliberately avoiding eye contact with me, which was never a good sign. He had better not try anything funny with me, or hide anything from me, I thought. He looked distinctly sheepish and very remorseful. Well, you know, Mr. Braxton, he said, dodging my eyes that had remained fixed on him intently, ever watchful for any signs of deception. Of course I know Mr. Braxton, I said. Indeed, everybody in our small American town knew Mr. Braxton, because he was the local eccentric, a slight oddball if you like. He was a tall man of about 6 foot, reasonably well built, long and lanky, with a pair of deep-set beady brown eyes. He was a dignified, upstanding citizen that was rigidly set in his ways, as he would have lunch at the local diner at about 12 o'clock sharp every single day without fail, and order exactly the same food, time after time. 2 sausages, bacon, pancakes, and fried eggs. It never differed. Then his grocery shopping was done equally as regimentally, at precisely 10 o'clock on a Monday morning. He played bridge with a couple of locals every Tuesday night, at about 7 p.m., and every day at about 9 o'clock in the morning he would be seen riding his favourite horse, Tiger Lily, around the countryside, nodding cordially at all the friendly locals who always waved at him. One thing we knew about Mr. Braxton is that he loved horses. Beyond that, no one knew much about him at all, because he barely said boo to a goose, and his conversation was so minimalistic. I think the most he would ever say is good morning, yes, no thank you, and please. That was about as flamboyant as his interaction got with any of the locals. Even during the Tuesday night bridge game, his hosts claimed that he clammed up like an oyster in a shell, and apart from a few grunts, he barely spoke a single word. As you can imagine, all kinds of rumours about him circulated around our town, as the locals were not adverse to engaging in gossip. It would seem that curiosity had reduced many into trying to fill in the missing blanks about Mr. Braxton's mysterious, enigmatic life. "He's a closet gay," someone said, "and his partner is hiding out in the farmhouse." Or he was married 5 times, suggested another person, and has hundreds of divorces behind him. It was all idle speculation, of course, as Mr. Braxton was not forthcoming about himself, and his secret life was cloaked in an aura of mystery. It would seem that in the 20 years he had resided in our part of the world, no one knew a thing about him. "So what is it about Mr. Braxton?" I repeated. "Well, Simon decided to do some undercover investigation," said Howard. "He wanted to break into Mr. Braxton's farmhouse. Well, not break in exactly, climb through the open window and surf through his belongings to learn all about him. There must be photographs hanging around the place, letters and stuff like that, to give us clues about the man. I suppose you could say Simon was being a private detective or a professional sleuth." I raised my brows cynically. "Private detective, please. It's called being a busybody," I said sarcastically. "Simon assumed Mr. Braxton was out of town, as every 2 months he usually stays with his brother over the weekend and gets a local farmhand to care for the horses. Simon thought he must be away." At this revelation, I was absolutely appalled. "So Simon was intending in breaking into Mr. Braxton's house while he was away to do some snooping? Is that what you're telling me? Do you realise that that is a criminal offence? I raised you better than that, Howard. I'm very ashamed." "I wasn't involved, Mum," my son protested indignantly. "Simon did not mean anything by it, Mum. We just wanted to learn about Mr. Braxton, that's all. What's the big deal anyway? It was harmless fun. We weren't hurting anybody." We wanted to find out if he'd been in the Air Force before, because he's so regimental and organised. We also wanted to know if he'd been married. You know, that sort of thing. What's wrong with being interested in the locals, Mum? It's called community spirit." "Is that what you call it?" I said in a sarcastic tone. "You think that breaking and entering into somebody's house and vandalising their personal belongings is acceptable behaviour? Simon was breaking the law, whatever way you look at it. And as for snooping through the poor man's belongings, it makes my skin crawl. You don't behave like that. It's disgusting. How would you feel if Mr. Braxton went ferreting through your belongings and spying on you?" "Not good," Howard admitted. "There you are, then. You don't do it. Such behaviour is reprehensible. If Mr. Braxton chooses to be private, if he wants to be a reserved person, leave him be, for goodness sake. Stop interfering and putting your protrusive meddling nose where it doesn't belong." Howard rolled his blue eyes to the back of his sockets. He was exasperated with me. I could see that clearly by the inflamed expression developing on his face. He correctly thought I did not understand. Of course I didn't. "If it makes you feel any better, Mum, Simon never broke into his house," he protested. "He never got the chance." "But he broke into the barn," I piped. "What on earth for?" "No, he didn't break into the barn," snapped Howard. "The barn door was wide open. He said he heard a loud crashing sound, and so he crept cautiously into Mr. Braxton's barn to see what the commotion was all about. It sounded like a wheelie bin being thrown over in the wind, or a metal container clanging and hitting the ground very loudly. Simon tiptoed into the barn. He hid behind a large wall of haystacks to see what was going on. He was naturally very curious. He actually thought it was a couple of raccoons messing around the place, looking for scraps. But instead, at the far end of the barn is a long row of built-in square storage containers for the horses, all with sealed lids, holding vast quantities of dried food for them to eat, such as molasses, oats and corn. You know, stuff like that. Anyway, Simon saw a large, dark, hairy figure rifling through the oats and munching them very hungrily. He said he could hear the jaws chomping away. Initially he thought he was observing a scavenging black bear on the prowl, because it was standing up on its haunches. All of a sudden he saw a raccoon boldly dart up to the bear and open his little paws, as if he was expecting a handout from the creature. At this point the bear turned around and placed some oats in the raccoon's hands, as if he had an unlikely friendship with the creature. It was then that Simon realised that this creature was not a bear, but it was Mr. Braxton himself. He was so shocked he could hardly believe it. The man was dressed up in a high-quality ape suit that was very realistic looking, so much so that it almost had him fooled for a moment. It was a very impressive outfit, must have set him back a pretty sum. He believed that this must be Mr. Braxton's deep, dark, secret fetish, dressing up as an ape-man, and so he was convinced that our theory about Mr. Braxton was very true, that he was indeed a weirdo. I mean, don't they always say that the quiet ones are the ones you have to watch? What I want to know is, how did Simon know it was Mr. Braxton wearing the ape costume? I asked. Because, Mum, he did. He said he could see Mr. Braxton's human face. The man had painted it with shoe polish to give it a leathery look to the skin, along with his telltale long slender hands. Even the large lanky long body shape and height all gave the game away, without a shadow of a doubt. This ape-like humanoid was Mr. Braxton, in a costume, of course. So after Simon told you what he'd seen, you decided you wanted to spy on Mr. Braxton yourself, I suggested. Is that right? Just to have a laugh at the poor man's expense. Hasn't he been through enough already? Well, not really. It was Phil's idea. We didn't have any intention of entering the house, but we did think that it would be fun to see Mr. Braxton dressed up in an ape suit. It seems like such a peculiar fetish to have. I mean, I've heard of grown men dressing up as babies before, or in women's clothes, but getting hot under the collar, wearing an ape suit, well, that's a new one even on me. I suppose we thought it would be rather entertaining. That's my point exactly, I said. You wanted to make fun of poor Mr. Braxton. If the poor man wants to dress up in an ape suit and hang around in his barn eating oats, let him be. Each to his own. It's not for us to judge what he does in his spare time behind closed doors. You boys are terribly mean. What happened, I asked. Did you see Mr. Braxton, as you'd expected? Well, I decided to meet up with Phil at midnight last night. You see, we know how methodical Mr. Braxton is. We assumed he dressed up as an ape at about 12:30, like he did the previous Saturday night. We were sure it was a regular routine for him, as he's always done everything in his life by the clock. I decided to go to sleep early. Sorry, Mum, but my concentration had waned after all that studying. The alarm on my cell phone woke me up at about 10 to 12. I woke up and seriously considered calling our little expedition off, as my bed was so cosy and I didn't want to get up. In truth, I didn't fancy going out at all, but I realised postponing our mission would make me a stick in the mud, or a spoilt sport, and I didn't want that. I quickly slipped out of the house, wiggling through the bedroom window, which I have to say is getting too small for me these days, as I nearly got stuck in between the bars. I grabbed my bicycle from the shed, along with my headlight, and met up with Phil outside the Drage residence, you know, the blue house on the far corner. He wasn't very pleased with me. He said he'd been waiting a good half hour, and was beginning to lose his patience. It was awfully chilly for the fall, and I really regretted not wearing a warm jacket, because the wind was blowing quite fiercely. Luckily it was a rather bright night with a full moon along with a silvery cluster of stars, so that had to be a good thing. But it was certainly weird being out on the road at night, because even with the sounds of the crickets and the frogs, it was spooky and creepy out there, alone in that dusky darkness. I was beginning to regret coming out at all, but I never expressed my misgivings to Phil. Anyway, we rode our cycles to Mr. Braxton's farmhouse, and we hid them in the hedgerow. We crept stealthily through the gate as quietly as we could, running towards the barn, hoping with all our hearts not to be seen. To our amazement, the barn door was wide open, and a light was on inside, but I realised it must be motion activated, and so we guessed that maybe Mr. Braxton was in the barn, doing his ape act. Well, that's what we thought anyway. Phil and I crept behind a large wall of haystacks, and we could see Mr. Braxton dressed there in his ape suit, seated on the ground with a plastic container in his hands, eating molasses and oats, and sharing some of the food with a friendly tame raccoon, who kept coming up to him with an open paw, asking for more all the time. I must say I was impressed with the ape costume. The face looked remarkably human. But I must say I didn't notice that it was Mr. Braxton's face at all. I didn't actually see the likeness. As you know, Phil has got a dreadful snorting laugh, which is his biggest impediment and downfall. Sometimes he has no way to control it at all, and it's always got us into no end of trouble, especially at school, when the teacher thinks he's laughing at her. I could see his face contort, and he was struggling to suppress his laughter, but he couldn't hold it in any longer, and began to honk with laughter, as he thought it hilariously funny that Mr. Braxton gets his kicks out of dressing like an ape. The worst thing about Phil is when he laughs, it's contagious, because he sounds so dreadful. So I began to laugh as well. "Mum," said Howard, grabbing my hand suddenly and squeezing it very tightly, "I've never known fear like I experienced in that moment. In a second, my laughter had subsided. My mouth just dropped open in astonishment. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I was so shocked. Oh, Mum, it was the most terrifying thing. This thing, he was so angry. I truly think he knew we'd been laughing at him and making fun of him, and he didn't like being humiliated. He was affronted and was standing close to us. So close, far too close for comfort. He was glaring at us with very intimidating brown eyes. Oh, Mum, I could feel his anger. It scared the living hell out of me. The creature was so defiant. He began to beat his chest with his fists as if he was showing us who was in charge. He rolled back his lips and growled at us, and the sound of that growl, the sound of it. There are no words to describe it. It was terrifying. Worse, much worse than a lion, 1,000 times worse. I've never felt so vulnerable in all my life. I felt as tiny and as inconspicuous as an ant. I knew that this creature could potentially punch my lights out with one swipe of his arms, and I would be dead. Mum, I wanted to run away as fast as I could. I really did. But my body, it wasn't cooperating with me. I stood there like a lemon, immobilized by terror, unable to move a single muscle. Phil shouted at me. He said, "Run, run." And then I started to flee across the ground towards my bike. I've never got on my bike as fast as I did then. And this thing, it was trailing behind us and breathing so heavily. We were both pedaling on our bicycles so fast as we possibly could. And this creature, oh, Mum, I nearly had a heart attack. This creature grabbed the bike, lifted it off the ground with me on it. I began to scream, and that was when I realised the creature had lifted my bike over a pothole, and he put my bike back onto the flat ground. "He stopped you from falling?" I gasped. "That's right. I could hardly believe it, Mum. I thought I was dead." "But you aren't, are you?" I said, cradling my son tenderly in my arms. "You're absolutely fine. What happened next?" Then he grabbed Phil's bike, and he pointed at Phil with his long arms, bending his head towards Phil and growling at him. Phil began to scream at the top of his lungs. The next thing I knew, we heard gunshots, and it was Mr. Braxton. He was standing there firing randomly in the air after the creature, and it fled away. It fled and ran into the woods as fast as it could. It sped away like grease lightning. It sounds to me as if the creature was giving Phil a piece of his mind and saying, "Don't you dare laugh at me or make fun of me." "That's what Phil thinks," said my son. "Mr. Braxton invited us into his house for cocoa, but he never said a word to us. He didn't even ask us if we were all right, nor did he question us about the strange creature holding down Phil's bike and challenging him. He didn't ask us why we were on his land even. It was weird. He is weird. I'm sorry, Mum, but he is. He said nothing, but of course we are grateful to him for scaring away the creature. It ran like the wind into the woods. We used a random excuse to Mr. Braxton, telling him we needed to relieve ourselves, and could he show us where his toilet facilities were. It was our opportune moment to learn about his life and to have a good snoop around his property. We were heartily disappointed. As we looked around his minimalistic, meticulous home, there wasn't a photograph in sight or anything to tell us a snitch about his life, so it still remains a mystery. That event happened over 20 years ago. My, doesn't time fly? I realised the creature my son encountered was most certainly a Bigfoot. It would seem he wasn't happy about being humiliated, but he clearly had a good heart, because the raccoon trusted him, which is a good sign. He also lifted my son and his bicycle over a pothole, which would have tripped him up in the middle of the night. Yes, he wasn't happy with Phil laughing at him, which makes him seem almost human, as none of us enjoy being belittled and humiliated. And as for Mr. Braxton, he always remained the mysterious eccentric in our small town. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, I watched my grandfather as his clumsy arthritic fingers unrolled the cellophane packaging of the thick, chunky cigar, tossing it carelessly to one side, where it landed precariously in the large ashtray. He popped the cigar into the edge of his slender mouth, lighting up the end of the stump with his gold lighter that had been given to him by my late grandmother when she was only 18 years old. Theirs had been a serendipitous love story, the likes of which they write movies about, as without her, my grandfather always divulged that the best part of him was now missing, like an amputated arm or leg. The cigar began to smoulder, and he puckered his lips inwards to inhale and suck some of the aromatic flavours out, and finally he exhaled, and wafts of cloudy smoke permeated the room in a warm, spicy, aromatic smell that I found swaddled me in a cosy warmth. "Ah, now that is so good," said my grandfather. "So very good." I could see his crinkled face, wrought with wrinkles that announced every year of his life that he had lived rather like the rings of a tree, suddenly begin to relax and straighten, almost as if the act of inhaling the spicy smoke had ironed out all his corrugated ridges, straightening them out like a clean white starched linen tablecloth. In my opinion, my grandfather was old, very old indeed, and as old as some of the trees that graced the woodgrove that fringed every corner of his miner's rustic cabin that had been built in 1885. He adamantly assured me that some of those trees had been there since he was a boy, which would almost certainly make them considerably ancient. I could only marvel at this astonishing, mind-blowing revelation. Could anything be older than my grandfather, I wondered? The entrenched, wizened furrows on his face cruelly betrayed his advancing age, and his handsome cornflower blue eyes were framed by a pair of opaque glasses, as over the years his dwindling eyesight had withered like the pretty wild flowers in the meadow at the end of the day. He looked good for his age. Well, so I'd been told by my mother. He was very willowy, but still athletic and lean, and his leathery sun-baked skin very weathered and rugged, a telltale reminder from his outdoorsy life, where he'd spent tireless hours in the great outdoors, enjoying the fruits of his labours from his hunting, shooting and fishing expeditions. What my grandfather did not know about the natural world was not worth knowing at all. It really was as simple as that. I looked on him in awe and wonder, like you might admire a Picasso painting at an illustrious art gallery. For in my eyes and opinion, my grandfather was infinitely more superior than some of the greatest masters that graced the covers of our history books, for he was my quintessential hero, and that is what really counted. I had begged my mother to let me stay with my Gramps, and persuasion had been as arduous as a tempestuous sea, but my nagging had finally worn my mother down like a waterfall eroding the rock face, and she had relented and given in like a helium balloon devoid of gas, withering away and finally deflating. She had wanted me to accompany her to my Aunt Hilda's home in Nantucket for the summer holidays, which is an elbow-shaped island 30 miles from Cape Cod by ferry, blessed with stunning lighthouses, exquisite beaches, foggy weather, and flat open countryside. I didn't want to be there, as Aunt Hilda, who had never had any children of her own, treated me with the disdain and disapproval of a strict authoritarian headmistress. If I had done anything to annoy her, she would beat the edge of my fist with the end of her wooden spoon, and glare at me defiantly with her hostile brown eyes that were cold and dispassionate. She would say, "Off with you now, Nathan. The dreadful sight of you makes my hair curl. There'll only be bread and milk for dinner tonight because you've misbehaved atrociously. I'm very disappointed with you, young man." True to her word, she would bring me a tray of bread and milk and lock me away in the confines of my own bedroom until the following morning, giving me all but a bedpan for my ablutions. In the morning, when she finally picked up my bedpan, she would deliberately wrinkle up her nose in disgust, as if she suspected the contents of my pan to be quite repulsive. I could always detect a gratified glimmer of pleasure in her eyes, as if in some way reprimanding me brought her a great deal of personal satisfaction. She made no secret of the fact that she simply despised children, and yet like a clockwork clown my mother brought me here religiously for every single summer holiday. Why? I couldn't even imagine. The worst part of it all is that my mother turned a blind eye to Aunt Hilda's regimental regimes of control and discipline, without raising any objections. Perhaps she was secretly intimidated by her somewhat ferocious older sister. I had a sneaking suspicion that this indeed was the case. While Aunt Hilda just loved to exercise her authority, rather like a flagging, degenerating muscle in need of serious toning. My mother, who was a schoolteacher by profession at the time, working at a local school in Chatham, would regularly take the ferry with me from the mainland in Cape Cod, where we lived all year round, to Nantucket, where we spent our summer holidays with Aunt Hilda. My father would remain at home, tethered to his scientific laboratory in the back of the yard or at the university. He was often labelled by many as the mad scientist, who looked as if one of his scientific experiments had gone awry, for his white hair stood up on edge like a spiky hedgehog, almost as if he'd experienced some kind of an electric shock during an explosive experiment, upon which his hair had fully paid the consequences, for even hot irons could not straighten those punky spikes out. I suppose it gave him a trendy look that was approved of by many of his science students at the university. Growing up, he was never around for us, as being a staunch workaholic, he perceived that spending time relaxing on a sandy beach was a catastrophic waste of time, invaluable lost expended energy that could have been so much better served learning, studying or experimenting. My father did not understand the modern concept of family holidays, nor did he identify with any form of relaxation whatsoever. He quite literally lived to work, and for him the world of scientific experiments outweighed the mundane drudgery of everyday life, and he would while away the long hours in the laboratory, sometimes for days at a time, with test tubes and beakers. So here I was in West Virginia with my Gramps, a solid 12 hours driving distance from Cape Cod, and the wider the distance from that venomous aunt of mine, the better, I thought happily, with a smug sense of satisfaction on my face. I was thinking about how disappointed Aunt Hilda would be not to have me around to bully any more. She would really miss that a lot. I could see that my grandfather was dozing off on the settee, rather reminding me of a sizable walrus basking on the sandy beach, making those grunts, as his snores weren't altogether dissimilar. The sound was so amusing, it was hard to suppress my giggles. I tiptoed cautiously towards the large box of cigars, so superbly presented in a lavish-looking ornate tin box covered in twee pitchers. Each expensive Cuban cigar looked so impressively beguiling and temptingly irresistible. I glanced quickly at my grandfather and could see that he was definitely asleep. Would he notice if I pinched one of his cigars, I wondered. It was doubtful, and it was worth the risk. I quickly pulled out a cigar from the box and grabbed the golden lighter, darting out of the small wooden cabin as quickly as I could. How I loved and adored this cosy gem of a bucolic primitive cabin, constructed from dogwood board and wooden siding, with a double-pitch shed roof. It was one excessively large, oversized room, with an outside outhouse as tradition dictates. It possessed a profane heater, an old-fashioned stove for cooking, a couple of cosy single beds, a large settee, bookcase, bureau, coffee table, cupboard, along with a large wooden table and chairs. For me it was an indelible mark on the landscape, a provocative reminder of marvellous summers spent fishing, hunting, hiking and tracking with my grandfather on this extraordinary, rustic, unpolished piece of land that had been in our family line for so many generations. Formerly a weekend hunting and fishing retreat, my grandfather had now transformed it into his forever home, and rightly so. I couldn't imagine a more spectacular place to live in the entire world, where blending into the rugged landscape was seamless. I quickly ambled towards the lake, which was to the front of my grandfather's property, several hundred feet away from the cabin, and I sat under a very large walnut tree there, on slightly moist ground that felt pleasantly warm to the touch, almost as if someone had warmed it for me. It was a magnificently beautiful day, with the sunlight dancing across the valley in a bright golden haze, whilst the shimmering silvery lake reflected the maple trees that flanked its far side like a large mirror, that I noticed had masterfully also picked up the fluffy clouds and the azure blueness of the sky to perfection. It was so peacefully tranquil by the lake, and I could hear the chirruping birds imbue the atmosphere with their pretty beguiling bird-song. My heart fluttered with excitement. This was my moment. The perfect moment I'd always longed for, a moment when I could taste the rich aroma of my grandfather's cigar and fill his shoes for a moment. Dare I try? I carefully slid the long, thick brown stub out of its packaging and trembled eagerly as my finger gently caressed it while I slipped it into the corner of my mouth. I suddenly felt so terribly grown up and incredibly important as I lit the cigar pensively with my grandmother's ornate golden lighter. It felt good, very, very good, as I began to smoke, inhaling in clouds of the aromatic vapour, and then reacting adversely to it by bursting sometimes into fits of coughing and spluttering as a result, for the fine wispy smoke had aggravated the soft lining at the back of my throat. I looked up quickly, swivelling my head to the right like a discerning owl. I had heard something, but what was it? Something was coughing and spluttering like me. Whoever they were imitating me. In a 3 o'clock position, I discerned a shadowy movement in the corner of my eyes that hijacked and stole my attention. To my amazement, standing only yards away from me, on a pair of powerful, muscular, human-like legs, was a Herculean-sized creature with an amused look in his deep-set dark eyes. I'd never seen anything like him before. The strange creature was copying my dexterous movements with his hands as he pretended to smoke with a make-believe cigar. His impressions were startlingly realistic and precise, including an exaggerated sequence of coughs and splutters, much like I'd done. This thing, whatever it was imitating me masterfully, like a phenomenal mime artist of note that would easily bedazzle Hollywood. But what was this strange, hairy, ape-like humanoid, I wondered? What was it? I don't even know how to describe my feelings at this point in time, as they were certainly twisted and knotted up, like a sailor's tangled rope. I don't know what I actually thought. I think I was too stunned to react, too amazed, really. I did try to comprehend the gravity of what I was perceiving, for this thing, this anomalous creature, certainly didn't fit into our stereotype of reality whatsoever. What was it, then? I couldn't be certain, for it resembled a tall man, covered in long, very sleek, coal-coloured hair. But then again, he wasn't entirely human either. He was certainly far too tall in stature and girth to be a man, for he was powerfully and very stockily built, with dense muscle tone. He towered at about 8 foot tall and 3 feet wide across the shoulder area. There were aspects to his anatomy that bore a rather striking, remarkable resemblance to a mountain ape, most notably seen in its dorsally domed head, hairless dark leathery face, defined prominent brow ridge, and deep-set treacle-coloured eyes. After a second of being imitated by this gargantuan-sized creature, my fear subsided and was expunged from me, like the squeezed water from a bath sponge. I sensed this warm-hearted creature meant me no harm at all, for he exuded a lively, congenial energy that was steeped in humour and fun. I threw the cigar at him playfully. He picked it up with his large human-like hands and began to try and smoke it, as I had done. And after his first disastrous inhalation attempts, he was coughing and spluttering as much as I had been, and this time he wasn't acting at all, as the smoke he inhaled had certainly irritated his throat, more so than it had mine. He wrinkled up his flat nose in disgust, as if to say, "Boy, that was nasty!" But that had not put him off at all. On the contrary, he was enjoying himself as much as I was, and the experience was mutually quite bonding. The creature's expressions were so hilariously funny that I couldn't help myself but laugh and laugh, so much so that my stomach began to ache, as the pain of the muscles twisted and turned around my abdomen, as if I'd done thousands and thousands of crunches. The trouble is, when I rolled over with laughter, so did the creature, as it was imitating me precisely and so brilliantly, which invariably meant I laughed all the more. So you cannot imagine the pain my stomach was in. This delightful creature was a natural comedian, and as he held my gaze with his twinkling eyes, he threw the cigar back to me, and so began our game of tossing the cigar to each other, backwards and forwards again and again, each taking a turn to take a puff, and we were both becoming happily embroiled in our fun-filled experience together. All of a sudden I heard my grandfather calling me. "Nathan! Nathan!" My heart sank at the sound of his voice, which brought the game to a swift, unfortunate halt. I glanced briefly at the creature, whose expression visibly dropped, as though he was rather disappointed, but he seemed to understand my need to have to leave. I pointed towards my grandfather's cabin, and then sprinted back home, hoping that I would see the strange creature again, but not altogether sure that I would. But the hope hung in my heart like a child's Christmas stocking on the hearth, in eager anticipation to be filled. "Have you seen my gold lighter?" asked my Gramp. "I could swear I put it down here after I had my last cigar." "No," I lied. "I haven't seen it, Gramps, but I'll help you look for it. It must have fallen off under the table. Maybe you dropped it." "You're a good boy, Nathan. Alas, my eroding eyesight is not what it used to be," he said, unleashing a heavy sigh. I wiggled out the golden lighter from my pocket and surreptitiously dropped it on the floor, pretending to find it. "Oh, here it is, Gramps," I said. "It was under the coffee table." My grandfather chuckled. "How the heck did it get there?" he joked. "This aging lark. It's not for the faint-hearted, let me tell you. Your grandmother would kill me from beyond the grave if I lost this precious lighter. It's even got my name engraved on it. Look," he said, showing it to me proudly. It read, "To my beloved Marcus, from your forever love, Christine." And so it was Gramps and I spent the rest of that blissful afternoon fishing at the lake, which was an angler's paradise, as it was bursting with a healthy supply of fish. We managed to catch 2 large bass of equal size and a catfish. It was over the fire pit here where my Gramp and I sat on 2 Adirondack chairs outside the cabin, where we baked our fish over the open flames, and it melted into the mouth as we ate it. It was certainly delicious. Why did the fish at home not taste this good, I wondered? And we lived in Cape Cod, for heaven's sake. It must be al fresco eating. That was where the heart of the secret lay. "Gramps," I asked suddenly, inspired by a secret longing to find out more about the strange creature I'd seen earlier on in the day, "do you get large people covered in hair living here in Virginia?" My grandfather's jaws opened in surprise, as if he couldn't quite believe what I was actually asking him. "How do you know about the wild man?" he asked me. "Who told you about them? I assume that is what you're talking about." I didn't want to tell my grandfather about the strange creature, obviously, because that would invariably mean confessing to my duplicity. Well, I did hear about it from somewhere, I think," I lied. "Really?" said my grandfather, looking rather bewildered. "I'm not sure I would be forthcoming about an encounter with a wild man if I'd had one and it were me," he said. "Most people think you've been drinking too much moonshine if you lay claims to such a sighting. For many believe that the legend of the wild man is just that, pure legend. But poor old Jason Dover, he learnt the hard way, as the folk in town teased him relentlessly about his startling claims of having seen a wild man that looked to possess remarkable ape-like features. No one believed him, of course, not a word of it. The man was not from honest stock, so his outlandish story backfired on him. Even in fact, if it were true." "Who is Jason Dover?" Gramps, I asked. "Jason Dover," said my grandfather, rolling the name around on the back of his tongue. "I haven't thought about Jason for a very long time. May God rest his soul." "So he's dead?" I asked. "He's dead all right," said my grandfather, lighting up a cigar and puffing the smoke in the air reflectively. "Tell me, Gramps," I urged. "Please tell me the story. I assume there is one to tell," I asked hopefully. "You're right about that. One night when Jason had slipped into Mr. Dyer's vegetable yard and began helping himself to beets, beans, squash and turnips, you know, that sort of thing. Well, he was pilfering for his mother, plonking everything into a very large wicker basket that he'd brought along for the ride, so to speak. He then heard a crunching sound, a sound of chewing and snapping, and that was when he saw something very large sitting around the edge of the bed of carrots and chomping them. On first impressions, it looked exactly like a bear. But given it was a very bright, pleasant night, and the prisms of moonlight bounced on the creature's hands, illuminating them incredibly well, he perceived that this animal did not have paws. It had hands, so he knew with a profound certainty that this creature was most certainly not a bear. By this time he was fascinated and very, very intrigued. What was this strange creature, he wondered. In his haste to find answers, he abandoned his baskets of goodies and surreptitiously crept from one beech tree to another, as these trees fringed the edge of a woodgrove that spanned the borders of Mr. Dyer's extensive, very well-fertilized vegetable yard. Jason silently moved ever closer towards the creature and had a great view of him in the light of the full moon. He described a tall, lanky creature with a face of a human and a dome-shaped head covered in very dark hair, sitting in the middle of the vegetable patch, scoffing carrots, along with the green foliage at its ends. The next thing he knew is that a large pair of hands had grabbed him around the waist, throwing him over a pair of powerful shoulders. He described being too shocked to even react or scream, as the shadowy form that had slipped out of the darkness had grabbed him so swiftly and so inconspicuously that it was almost too surreal and too dreamlike to comprehend that this was actually happening to him. The creature glided with him, straddled over his shoulders like a large sack of potatoes, and her running was like gliding because it was seamlessly smooth, almost as if she was skating on ice. In a trice he was jolted violently to his senses, in the horrified realization of what was actually transpiring. He was overwhelmed with a vast measure of angst, terrified that this creature might harm him. But common sense ultimately prevailed when he realized that if the creature wanted him dead, he would have been a goner already, for this thing could have swiped him across the head with one fatal blow, and it would be over Godovers for him. He ascertained the creature was female, possibly the mother of the tall, lanky youngling in the vegetable patch that was eating the carrots. She must have spotted him spying on her little one, and was naturally protective, possibly concerned that he might pose a threat. He described his abductor as smelling like hay or freshly mown grass, a very, very pleasing smell indeed. Imagine his amazement when the creature dropped him outside his very own car. She waited for him to open the door and to drive away. He said he felt as if she had literally escorted him off the property. Imagine his surprise to discover that the basket of vegetables he had left in Mr. Dyer's vegetable patch had been returned to him forthwith, dropped on his front doorstep the following morning, which meant that the creature even knew where he lived, knew the car he drove, and knew that the basket of vegetables was indeed his. It made him determine that these strange creatures may know us even when we don't know them at all. So they're like the invisible eyes of the forest that watch and observe our every move, while we remain blindly oblivious that they're even there. Wow, that is an incredible story, I said. Do you believe it's true? Oh, I do, said my grandfather. I rarely do. You see, Jason Dover. Oh, well, he was a man of few words. Left school at 12 years old. Not very educated or articulate, with a pretty abysmal imagination. This is a story he wanted to share, because it was possibly the most exciting thing that had ever happened to him in his entire life. But regretfully for him, no one believed a word of it, but you did. Of course, Jason would never have made it up. He just couldn't. He wasn't clever enough to make a story up. I'm in no doubt that it was true. Why did he die, I asked. What happened to him? Oh, it was a dirt bike accident. Got flung over the handlebars, I think. It happens. And you, Gramps, did you ever see the wild man, I asked. Not on your Nelly. Oh, I've seen signs that indicate that he's out there somewhere. I'm a tracker, you know, so I see things like that. I've noticed things over the years like large humanoid footprints that were almost certainly made by the wild man. Then I've seen anomalies in the wood. You know, branches being dislodged and shaped into specific ways, like an invisible marking system that only the wild man would understand. So yes, I know they're out there. Your grandmother saw one once, when she was out berry picking in the woods one day. I do remember that. She said everything in the woods became eerily quiet. The birds' song dissipated. She got the overwhelming sense she was being watched. Then something made her glance towards a maple tree. And there was this tall creature, completely covered in hair, just staring at her, with such an intense fascination. But once it realized it had been seen, it glided away. Of course, when she told me her story, she kept saying, "Marcus, it happened so quickly. I keep asking myself, did I really see that?" But she knew that she had. But such a sighting is hard to get your head around. I visited my Gramps' cabin for many years after that, successfully managing to avoid those trips to Nantucket to stay with my Aunt Hilda until he died about 30 years ago. My family now own the quintessential old cabin that used to belong to my grandfather and carry on the age-old tradition of enjoying it for short holidays. I seriously regret to say that I never saw the creature that I shared the cigar with all those years ago, that I now know to be a Bigfoot. I seriously regret that. These days I enjoy the same Cuban cigars my Gramps smoked when I was a young boy. And when I light them with the gold lighter that I inherited, and I open up the cellophane packaging and inhale the delicious aromatic smoke, I certainly think of the day I smoked my first cigar with a creature that I now know to be a Bigfoot. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, Sheriff Ernest Farnborough looked exasperated and piqued. Of course he tried to hide his frustration with a wry smile, but it was exceedingly difficult to suppress the level of irritation that he was actually feeling. It was the third time this week that annoying elderly woman had made her appearance known. She was perched in his offices right now, on his favourite black leather swivel chair. A very determined-looking woman with frosted grey hair and pale blue eyes, who was tirelessly harassing him with her obscure, implausible claims. He had seen her type before. Truly, she was as annoying as a Rhode Island red, pecking away at him tirelessly, or a feisty mosquito resolutely buzzing around him all night, eluding him of a peaceful night's sleep. If the truth be told, this badgering woman would be good for the force, as things tended to be flung to the wayside and placed on the back burner, like old cases, evidence reports, or missing case files, that would probably be attended to swiftly and efficiently under this woman's watchful eye. In his mind's eye he could even foresee the neat filing system her efficiency would command, and the miraculous transformation of his unmethodical office from indiscriminate to systematic and ordered. Yet despite the obvious advantages of such an elderly woman hired by the force, he was secretly thankful someone like her was definitely not in their employ, as her constant nagging would drive him doodle-alley, he mused privately to himself. His current secretarial assistant, also in the winter season of her life, was as slow as a sloth, who turned his office upside down with her chaotic organisational skills. She did have her good points, he assured himself. He scratched what remained of his thinning grey hair reflectively, pondering over what good points she actually had, if indeed she had any at all. For a while he couldn't think of a single redeeming quality about her, as his mind just kept drawing blanks. Suddenly his well-rounded face lit up brightly like a Christmas tree. He remembered something quite significant, very significant indeed. Of course, his secretarial assistant had always collected over a dozen caramel and apple doughnuts and several piping hot lattes from the baker, every single day, and did so as a matter of routine, something that his formidable wife Kate would never ever countenance. He glanced down briefly at his inflating waistline and the oversized stomach that imbricated over his pants, the final resting place of the collective doughnuts that had left their indelible mark on his rather rotund physique. There had been times when his unkind wife, who was like a nauseating stick insect, eating about as much as a songbird, would sometimes call him her sweet little beached whale, and that was very humiliating and condescending to him. So in retaliation, he called her his sweet little praying mantis, and that had gone down like a lead balloon. But he was sticking to this new pet name for her, come hell or high water, despite her enraged protests. Serves her right, he thought smugly. That's what you get for making fun of me. In that second, he promptly decided that despite the fact that he looked like he was on the verge of giving birth to triplets, the donuts were not going anywhere. They were here to stay, and for good. It was very tough being a police sheriff with the demands of a small town weighing heavily on your shoulders. The calls in the middle of the night about strange banging sounds that were inevitably just raccoons digging around in a dumpster, or someone else who claimed that they were having a dispute with a neighbour. He let out a huge sigh, which he tried to suppress by mimicking a yawn, while the annoying old woman rambled on, barely stopping to even draw breath. With his pen and paper, he continued to recall the details of her painstaking account that were almost identical, and a replication of all her previous police reports that she had filed at the station over the last few days. It would seem a tall, shadowy peeping Tom had sneakily been spying on her through the living room window while she was knitting a sweater for her grandson when watching a BBC wildlife documentary on television presented by the highly esteemed David Attenborough. "I'm tired, Sheriff, very tired," she claimed, "about you lot not doing a damn thing to help me about my current predicament. You're not taking me seriously at all." Her perceptive eyes glanced judiciously across the body of files that covered his mahogany desk untidily, as if deducing that the sheriff was clearly not the most organised of people, and unordered people had the propensity to rub her up the wrong way, for disorder was as alien to her as candy is to a lion. It was nonsensical to be this disorganised, surely. She could almost understand it if he was dealing with some of Chicago's lowlives and gangland shootings where ubiquitous criminal cases were piling up. But this was the quiet, peaceful community of Montana, for goodness sake, where crime was not exactly a huge problem. Yet by the look of the sheriff's desk, you would think he was inundated with criminal reports. "You lot have only been around to my farmhouse once, Sheriff," she complained. "It's disgusting, it really is. You haven't even searched the wood grove on my property to ensure that there are no vagrants around. You lot have not done a thing to help me. It's sickening, quite sickening. Don't think I don't know the score. You think I'm a silly old batty woman who's hallucinating as a result of too much medication. But that's where you're wrong. I don't even take medication. Nothing at all. I may be in my 80s, Sheriff, but I'm of sound mind, and in remarkably good health, I might add." "But do you indulge in the occasional tipple?" "Well, I have a gin and tonic before bed from time to time, but, Sheriff, I've never ever overindulged, as it isn't a wise thing to do for a woman of my age. It would mess with my algorithms." "So, Mrs. Myers, shall we start from the very beginning? What exactly did you see that makes you believe you are dealing with a peeping Tom?" asked the sheriff. On this occasion it was the old woman's turn to sigh, but she didn't mask her increasing frustration, for indeed she hoped the sheriff would begin to appreciate her rising level of angst, as she discerned that someone had indeed been spying on her at her home. Whoever it was, he had wanted her to know that he was there. Possibly he got his kicks from scaring an old woman half to death, and if that was indeed his intention, he had succeeded with flying colours. Unfortunately, she hadn't been wearing the correct glasses to see the intruder clearly enough, but had perceived a sizable blurry dark blob moving against the window pane, and caught the glimmer of the man's brown sparkling eyes staring in at her. A terrifying sight that had sent her blood running cold and caused her heart to thump in her ears, and she had felt its powerful vibration in her chest for quite some time after the encounter. She'd even seen the figure gliding away towards the wood grove at the rear of her property. Who was he? What did he want from her? And why, oh why, did he seem so obsessed with gaining her attention? The very thought of this mysterious intruder sent horrifying chills down her spine like mini electric shocks. Paige Myers was no stranger to being stalked, for when she was a young woman she had been a knockout, quite a looker really, that had drawn the attention of many admiring male fans who had swooned over her like frenzied bees around a honeypot, or seemingly intoxicated and bedazzled by her exotic beauty, with her raven blue-black hair, flaxen-coloured skin, pretty heart-shaped face, high cheekbones, arched brows, along with beguiling deep blue eyes that contrasted dramatically against her deep skin like aquamarine jewels. Unfortunately, while Paige had secretly enjoyed the attentions her flocking admirers had lavished upon her, the fleeting pleasures were soon eclipsed by the unsavoury, obscene attentions of Joey Sutcliffe, for this was a young man she most certainly did not want to be acquainted with in any way. He hung around in the circles of some of Chicago's less desirable characters like a rather bad smell. He had spotted her once at the station and had trailed after her like a hound pursuing a fox, and from thenceforth never ever leaving her alone. What had been his absurd, twisted interest in her anyway, as they had nothing in common at all, and were both from opposite sides of the track, and she was well above his station. He knew that, yet he didn't care, for he wanted ownership of her more than anything else in the entire world. This unsavoury character looked every part the type of lad you would expect to find locked up in a prison cell, for he was rough around the edges and hard-wired to be thuggish and aggressive like a pit bull terrier, but in human form, that is. Even his mean, cold eyes were like tiny slits, and his thin smile turned downwards in a perpetual scowl, while his white anemic skin wore the indelible marks of a fighting dog. There were dozens of jagged, ugly scars embedded in his thick, stocky body like railway tracks, along with healed-over bullet holes revealing the horrors of a gangster lifestyle that he had lived, survived and conquered as a ruffian on the streets of Chicago. It was in the dark, dingy back streets of the city where he had become ensnared by the drug culture and was not afraid to fight to the death if he had to. This hideous, reprehensible man, for indeed there is no other way to describe him, had relentlessly pursued her for 7 years, stalking her without showing any signs of pulling out the plug or retreating. He was obsessed with her, well and truly. She never thought she'd escape his prying eyes, for he watched her with the intensity of a ravenous vulture hankering over a decomposing corpse. It would seem that spying on her unwaveringly had become the order of his every waking moment, and the essence of everything that he lived and breathed for. He had looked at her through windows, followed her to libraries and grocery shops, trailed behind her in the car, and sent her amorous letters and gifts in the post expressing his unfailing, ceaseless love for her. Yet despite her best efforts to tell the besotted Joey to leave her alone or simply bog off and get lost, the more she rejected his attentions, the more infatuated and voracious his inflamed passions burned towards her, rather like an insatiable, unquenchable fire that could not be quashed or rescinded. Of course she had reported her encumbrance to the local sheriff, of whom Joey was well known to them as a gangster of some notoriety. The police had never taken her seriously, and had simply given Joey a slap on the wrist and a pitiful caution or reprimand, where he was told to give her a wide girth. In those days they didn't take stalking as seriously as they do now. Of course that had been as helpful as telling a wet dog to dry in the rain. It was never, ever going to happen, and furthermore he failed to listen to them by unabatingly hankering after her like an impassioned dog on heat all the more. No one understood the depths of her despair, the levels of trepidation and fear that had sequestered her, holding her hostage and shackling her to an awe-consuming terror. It had devoured her life like a hungry worm in an apple, eating away at her from the inside out, for she had felt so lost and helpless, desperately seeking the security and safety she craved. One day she found a way out of the glass container that had been her life for 7 years, but she concluded she was indeed living on borrowed time, for she was absolutely certain one day that Joey's attention towards her would finally turn violent. It happened when she learnt by chance that Joey was actually fighting for his life in a hospital bed after a devastating shootout with some opposing gangsters, but he was expected to make a full recovery. This was her chance to escape, and to be finally set free from the attentions of Joey Sutcliffe, while he was relegated to the confines of a hospital bed. Indeed, her parents and friends had encouraged her to take a leap of faith and get the hell out of Chicago and disappear, so that when Joey had finally recuperated, he would never ever find her again, for she would vanish without a trace. Of course she knew he would survive his injuries, for people like him always did, but she was certain of one thing: he would never, ever bother her again. The Rocky Mountain state of Montana had seemed like the perfect quintessential spot in the world for her to disappear, and it had worked better than she could have ever contemplated, for she had blended into the new lifestyle as seamlessly as Cinderella had fitted into her golden slipper. Everything about Montana had warmed the cockles of her heart, from the friendliness and openness of the people, the lonely isolation of the plains, the majesty of the mountains, the long stretches of roadways, the endless sky, space and fresh air. She had moved to a beguiling wooden farmhouse in the countryside that was as pretty as a picture, that had lived up to her wildest, most fanciful dreams and expectations. It was a typical American farmhouse with 2 stories, an asymmetrical massing, a distinctive front gable, central chimney and wraparound porch, with classical columns. The dramatic contrast of the coal roof, along with the black wooden window frames and matching shutters against the stark whiteness of the walls, was a pronounced contradiction that was visually arresting and aesthetically very appealing. Better still, her home overlooked exquisite mountainous views and was surrounded by wood groves, flowery meadows and awesome walking and hiking trails. What was there not to like? For 60 long years she had called this place her home, had never ever married, worked in the local town, and surrounded herself with friends, and never once had she ever been afraid. Well, not until now, that is. All the haunting memories of her youth came flooding back to her, assaulting her mind with memories she had chosen to suppress, of times when the likes of Joey Sutcliffe had robbed her life of peace, for he had stalked and hounded her relentlessly, and she knew he was the real reason that she had never married. Could it be, she pondered to herself, that Joey had found her after all these years, and he was the creeping stranger looking at her through the windows of her home at night, spying on her as he had done in former years? Was it even possible that he had finally managed to find her, after 60 years of searching? Surely he was not still fixated on her. She was an old lady, for goodness sake, and her youthful beauty had been fleeting and had now faded. So why would he still be interested in her now? As Paige reflected on all these thoughts, she began to tremble. Her blue eyes almost looked fearful, as the guarded look she'd been wearing at the police station had suddenly dissipated. She fiddled with her purse awkwardly, fumbling around with the clasp, opening it and grabbing out her pink lipstick and hand mirror. It helped to deflect her troubles, to keep her fingers busy and occupied. So with shaking, frail fingers weathered by age, she applied the lipstick to her lips, but her trembling escalated, so the application was very scant. But her little charade had certainly not fooled the sheriff. He knew she was hiding something. "I think you've got something that you're keeping from me. You're keeping a secret that you don't want to share. You know who has been spying on you," said the sheriff, suddenly looking directly into Paige's pale blue eyes. "I've been a detective for a very long time, Miss Meyer, and I know when someone is being deceptive. You are clearly hiding something from me. The question is, what? That's what I would like to know." Paige tried to avoid the sheriff's discerning eyes. Well, it's probably just nothing. It happened a very long time ago. I was a young girl then, and really rather pretty, I'll have you know. That actually turned out to be my biggest problem." "What happened?" asked the sheriff. "Well, I was a victim of stalking in Chicago when I was in my early 20s. He was obsessed with me. A nasty piece of work. Oh, he was awful. I ran away to Montana to disappear and to vanish. I thought I'd never ever see him again. But I mean, I'm an old woman now. Surely he—" Her words trailed off and got lost, as they became almost disembodied and faint. The sheriff's heart melted like warm chocolate as he watched the tears slowly spilling down the old woman's cheeks. "Ah, there now," he said gently, handing the tissues over to her. "It's not that bad, surely. If it makes you feel any better, I think it's very unlikely and highly doubtful that your old stalker is suddenly back on the scene. It's been a long time since you were last hounded by him, and there's a lot of water under the bridge. He'd be an old man by now, dealing with all kinds of issues, health problems even. He might not even be alive today. "What is this man's name?" he asked. "It's Joey Sutcliffe. His street name was the Viper." "I'll run some checks on him to put your mind at rest, if that makes you feel any better. You wait here. I'll make some inquiries for you." Paige felt relief flood over her mind. Finally, the sheriff was listening and paying attention to her plight. As a victim of stalking, she knew something had been watching her, and those familiar, ominous feelings had finally returned. Perhaps the sheriff would get to the bottom of this mystery and find the answers that she was looking for. As the sheriff returned to the office with some papers in his hands, the way he walked into the room with a slow deliberation and a downcast expression on his face, she instinctively knew that the news wasn't good, and it concerned Joey Sutcliffe. She was dreading what he was going to tell her. "Ah," said the sheriff, "this is all very bizarre indeed. It would seem that Mr. Sutcliffe is very much alive today, but he has been missing now for over 3 weeks. He appears to have vanished from his apartment in Chicago, without a trace, and seemingly disappeared into thin air." The old woman let out a horrified gasp. Oh no," she said, cupping her hands over her mouth. "You don't think that—" "I'm not sure what to think," said the sheriff. "Stranger things have happened. Obsession is a very peculiar thing. This man could indeed be still obsessing over you. I gather he has never married, and is in very good health, regularly partaking in local marathons. So it's possible he could still be your stalker. One of the oldest stalking stories I've ever dealt with, if that is indeed the case. For there is a first time for everything, but we can only hope that he is not the one that is spying on you." "He could be camping out in my wood grove," said Paige, looking alarmed. "Sheriff, what should I do?" "I would like to stay over at your home tonight, if I may, with my deputy sheriff. I want to keep a vigil and an eye on that window of yours, where you claim to have a sighting of the peeper. We will be dropped off at your home in the corner of the road, using the cover of darkness to our advantage to ensure that the peeper is not aware of our presence, as we will enter your home by the back door and keep a very low profile." "Oh, thank you, Sheriff. You've no idea what this means to me." "Oh, I think I do, ma'am," said the sheriff, saluting her with his left hand. It was autumn in Montana, and the wind blew through the towering logpole pines, causing the fine needles to rustle, and these 100-foot skyscrapers appeared to almost jiggle and dance under the dark sky. It was menacing, a friendless night, with a cold biting chill to the air, and the sound of crickets and frogs appeared very subdued. It was just as well the sheriff and his deputy were wearing headlamps and were armed with flashlights, for the scattering of stars and the moon was very obscure and inconspicuous. "Oh, my word! Forget autumn. Winter is almost here," Ernest piped the deputy. "It's a freezing night. Do you think we'll see any action tonight?" "I sincerely hope so," said the sheriff. "The poor old dear is in a dreadful state. At the very least, we want answers. We need to find out who or what is spying on her. She is very unsettled. She's clearly been a victim of stalking, and that's not pleasant for anyone. We need to give her some kind of reassurance." "You think it could really be her ex-stalker, Sheriff? It sounds a bit far-fetched to me. I mean, the woman is so old. Surely he wouldn't be interested in her now. If he was going to be chasing anyone, surely he'd be chasing someone that was about 20. I don't know what to think, Deputy. Obsession is a very peculiar thing, and I've seen things in this line of work that would make your hair curl. So honestly, nothing would surprise me." That evening the sheriff and his deputy were whisked stealthily into the old woman's cosy home, where they sat very discreetly on the furthest couch in the far corner of the living area, where they drank strong mugs of coffee to stay awake and tucked into sweet Black Forest chocolate doughnuts. It was opposite a window where the curtains were drawn so as to avoid detection and to remain unnoticeable. The old woman was seated on the upholstered chair close to the fire crackling away in the grate that overlooked a window which the curtains remained open, where she usually spotted the shadowy figure looking in at her with deep-set dark eyes. She recoiled in horror at the memory of that horrifying moment when she realized that she wasn't alone. She extracted her knitting and put on the television. The bait had been set, but would the peeper take a bite? That was the question. Would he be peering in at her tonight? In her heart she crossed her fingers and toes and hoped that this night would be fruitful. The television blared away loudly, in succession to the clicking of the old lady's knitting. The sheriff sat silently on the couch, listening and waiting with bated breath, but for a while nothing happened. But then his ears perked up as he discerned a noise, and indicated for everyone to stay quiet. Shh! Shh! He was certain he'd picked up a rustling sound, but with the wind blowing against the rafters of the house, it could literally be anything. Then he heard the rustling sound again, and then a rattling sound, and he clutched his pistol and manoeuvred himself stealthily along the wall, facing the window that overlooked the old woman. Then he saw it, a dark face peering into the window, with bright eyes and a large flat nose smudged against the pane. He immediately indicated to his deputy to follow him, and they silently exited through the back door of the kitchen and began to cautiously creep around to the front of the house towards the living area, where the intruder was engaged in his espionage. The wind was blowing against the house, causing one of the loose shutters to rattle quite violently. The detective, upon seeing the large figure wearing a thick black woolly coat, looking in through the living room at the old lady, skillfully emerged from his hiding place and cautiously, surreptitiously crept towards the man. "This is the police," he said. "Hands up." The large figure turned around to look directly at the sheriff. Its treacle-coloured eyes exuded a menacing red eyeshine, which was exceedingly intimidating. This was not a man in a fur coat as he'd first suspected. This was something else. But what in the heck was it? The cocky confidence of the sheriff dissipated like the vaporous steam from a kettle, and his fingers began to tremble and shake, while his heart pounded violently in his chest, causing his whole body to vibrate. For a second it was like the hands of time stood still, and every single passing second seemed to last a lifetime, for the sheriff knew he was standing in the presence of a mighty apex predator. Suddenly he felt like a silly little kid with a pathetic toy gun in his hands, as using a weapon against this being would be futile and crazy, for this would make the creature even angrier, and put his life in great jeopardy. The sturdy, robust, seemingly bulletproof creature towered at about 8 foot tall, and was built like a rhino in terms of its immense stocky proportions and very pronounced muscular density. It was solid, burly, lofty and powerful, and luxuriously swathed in a silky long coat of black hair that was blacker than the night, and the severe contrast between the creature's hair and the dusky sky was strikingly sinister. The outside light enabled the sheriff to see the obscure features of the creature more clearly, where the charcoal black of the leathery hairless face merged seamlessly into the pitch blackness of his hair. Without a doubt, its ponderous heftiness made him appear like a ghostly shadow figure, or like something supernaturally anomalous. What was this creature, the sheriff wondered? It looked human, especially the face, but the dome shape of the head and the overlong arms reminded him of a primate. One thing he knew for certain was that this creature was highly intelligent, and by the truculent expression upon its face, it was not best pleased to be challenged like this, and its discerning eyes darted from the sheriff's face to the weapon in his hands, that was by now pointed loosely at the creature. The creature curled back its lips, releasing a deep, low, guttural growl that egressed from the back of his throat and sounded like thunderous rocks rolling down a high embankment, or like the centres of the earth splitting in two and cracking open like a large egg. It was a sound that spoke of treacherous animal power and primal savagery, a sound birthed from our deepest fears and our darkest, most terrifying nightmares. In a seamless, lunging motion, the overlong muscular arms seized the sheriff's weapon and threw it up towards the chimney, hitting it with a hole-in-one. Now defenceless, the sheriff stood there like a gormless frozen statue, just gawking at the creature with helpless glazed eyes that were seemingly locked in a trance. He struggled to break free from this invisible hold, but was powerless to do so. Why could he not bolt back to the house right now? What in the heck was wrong with him? He could feel the presence of death looming ever closer, ready to snatch him and drag him away, kicking and screaming. For he knew he was not ready to die. Not yet. Please, no. All of a sudden the sound of the deputy sheriff's firearm went off, and he shot several rounds in the air. And like greased lightning, the creature thundered away, moving into the wood grove at an immense speed, with the grace and elegance of a cheetah. "Sheriff, are you all right?" said the deputy. "You're as white as a sheet. What in the heck was that thing?" The sheriff turned to look at his deputy. "That," he said to the deputy, "was my worst nightmare that came to life." I learnt about this incredible story from my grandfather, who was the sheriff in town when this happened many moons ago. And although he's now deceased, I'm in absolutely no doubt that the creature he encountered that night was in fact a Bigfoot, who was clearly very curious about Paige, and not one bit happy about being challenged by the sheriff. I was to learn that my grandfather never told Paige about the monster he had encountered because he didn't want her to live in fear, but was able to assure her that the vagrant he had seen was not Joey Sutcliffe. It would seem the old woman began to breathe again, as her relief was immense. As far as Joey Sutcliffe was concerned, his deceased body was one day found floating down a lake in Chicago, and foul play was suspected. If any good did come from that evening, my grandfather informed me that the old woman was never bothered by the creature ever again, and died peacefully in her own home at the grand age of 93. So there you are. That's my story.
Dear Sarah and all your listeners, I've seen that some on your channel have been courageous enough to share their horrifying experience with the creature called Bigfoot, especially fellow police officers like myself. It made me feel that if they could be plucky and courageous enough to share their Bigfoot encounter with you, then so should I. Naturally, I want to remain anonymous. It's a priority for someone in my profession, which I believe your listeners will appreciate and understand. My encounter happened in Florence, Oregon. The property in question was a medium-sized family cabin that was situated on Wohink Lake with 400 feet of lakefront frontage that could be enjoyed from a huge wooden deck that surrounded the cabin, offering the most glorious views over the lake. There was also a back garden of about 150 acres with areas of ubiquitous trees of every kind that were scattered everywhere on this rural location, making it the ideal setting for all kinds of wildlife, including loads of free-range chickens that belonged to the owner. It was in 1987, in July of that year, that I got a phone call from a woman called Gillian, who was experiencing some strange activity on her property. When I arrived, I could see the relieved look on her face. "I'm so glad you're here," she said. "I really need to talk to someone about this." "Of course," I said. "How can I be of help?" Gillian looked at me with a little resistance, as if she had to be guarded about what she told me. "Look," she said, "every night there is the most dreadful pounding all over my cabin, almost like someone is hitting it violently with a metal pole. The sounds are quite frankly utterly terrifying. I did go out to see if anything was there, but it was deathly quiet outside. Not a sound could be heard, which is unusual. I mean, even the crickets weren't singing on that night. I got the distinct impression that someone was spying on me and hiding. I did hear heavy breathing, but I looked around and no one was there. I walked around the property and there was nothing, but I found 3 of my chicken heads just lying on the ground next to a huge pile of plucked feathers. It really was most bizarre." "Have you ever had anything happen like this before?" I asked. "No," said Gillian, "I can't say that I have." "Do you know of any person that may wish to scare you?" "Well, there is my ex-husband, who is very bitter about our divorce, but I do not think he would stoop this low to try and scare me. Surely not." "You would be surprised," I said. "The stories I could tell you would make your hair curl about the revengers of exes." "You really think my ex-husband could be behind this?" she said, looking aghast. "He was very upset that I did get the cabin. I know that really put him out. But I never imagined he'd react like this and try and scare me half to death." "It's a distinct possibility," I said. But it would be foolish for us to jump to conclusions too quickly. There could be multiple explanations for all this. Should I be worried? She asked me. Ma'am, I don't know at this stage, but call me any time, day or night, and I will be out here like a shot, I said. I examined her property for any telltale signs of the intruder, but frankly all I noticed was a large footprint in the mud. That was very big, and it was of a bare foot. Ma'am, I said, just one more question. Does your husband have big feet? And does he ever go around without shoes on? Oh, he hates shoes, she said. He never wears them unless it's winter, of course. And yes, he's got big feet. He's 6 foot, you know. How did you know that? Nothing, I said. I was just wondering. I was now convinced that her husband was trying to scare her. Maybe he was angry about her getting the cabin in the divorce settlement and was trying to drive her away from her property so that he could get his greedy hands on it. It was a really beautiful cabin with sensational views. I couldn't blame him for wanting it. I fancied it myself. That night the woman called me again, and this time she was freaking out. Someone had been screeching on her property like a banshee, and the dreadful banging was continuing and getting worse and worse, and someone had thrown a huge boulder through her window and shattered all the glass. I was at the property within minutes and was met by the woman sobbing uncontrollably, telling me that she had seen a monster with red eyes spying at her through the window and growling. You go inside, I said, trying to reassure her, and I will go and investigate. I immediately suspected that the husband was hiding on the property, and I realized that he was a really nasty fellow, putting on a scary mask in order to drive his wife from her cabin. I had seen some nasty husbands in my time, but this took the biscuit with this level of spite. I walked around the rural property with the rambling shrubbery, long grass and beautiful abundant trees. I was lighting up the area with my torch, looking to see if I could detect any noises. It seemed incredibly quiet, almost eerily so, and there were no animal sounds, which was odd for a rural setting. Come out, Mr. Walker, I said. The game is up and I know you're there. You need to give up this ludicrousy of stalking your wife, or she'll fire a restraining order on you, and I will be charging you for wasting police time. So come out from your hiding place now. All was silent. There was no answer. Suddenly I saw a shadowy form peering at me from behind a tree, and now I knew Mr. Walker's hiding place, although I pretended not to have seen it. I decided I would pounce on Mr. Walker unaware and take him by surprise, and then I would cuff him and take him back to the station. So that's exactly what I did. I got on top of Mr. Walker and tried to hold him down, but he was so strong. I really thought it was Mr. Walker in a ghillie suit. Mr. Walker hurled me in the air like a pizza. I just went flying in the air, and I landed in the middle of a huge fish pond that I didn't even know was there. Neither did Mr. Walker, because he looked as surprised as I was. You see, the pond was covered in thick green water lilies. Sopping wet, I climbed out of the pond to face a fierce standoff with Mr. Walker. But now I knew this was not Gillian's husband, but a real-life monster, the likes of which I'd never seen before. Whatever on earth it was, my rifle had been lost after the creature had flung me into the air, and now I was totally defenseless. What on earth is this horrendous-looking thing, I wondered. The creature looked like he had these horrible black dreadlocks over his body, and they were matted and nasty, with a funky odour that was far from pleasant, like damp, sweaty, cheesy trainers. This creature was about 6.5 feet tall, with a huge chest almost as wide as he was tall, and long muscular legs, long arms, and a head that was shaped like one of my bullets. The creature was humanoid, with a distinct early man sort of appearance about him, with ape-like influences to his overall appearance. The creature let out the most horrendous scream and glared at me with his huge menacing red eyes. He then lifted up the left side of his lips and snarled at me, and I could tell in that instant that he was going to kill me. I did not have a shadow of a doubt in my mind. He lunged towards me and grabbed me with a huge hand, with fingers like pork sausages. He suddenly let go of me when he heard the sound of a rifle being unloaded and aimed directly at him, and one of the bullets hit him in the upper leg, and the creature winced with pain and let go of me, and then he went thundering through the undergrowth like an angry rhino. "Thank you," I said as Gillian approached me with her rifle in hand. "I think you just saved my life. That was an excellent shot." "Oh," she said, "that's nothing. I'm quite good with a gun, even if I say so myself. I was just in no doubt that he was going to kill you. I was watching him from the kitchen window, and what a stroke of luck that you ended up in my pond, or I think we would not be talking now." I didn't even know the pond was even here." "I know," she apologized. "I always forget to tell people it's there, and they invariably always fall in because they don't see it. I've been meaning to clean it out for a long time." "It's a good thing you didn't," I said. So that was my Bigfoot story. I got in touch with Gillian, and over the last few years, she had no further sightings of the creature. That gunshot scared him off for good. We both realized after our research that we had indeed encountered a Sasquatch, and both of us decided that if we told anyone about it, we would be ridiculed. Gillian has agreed that I can share my story with you today, provided, of course, that our identities are not revealed. I hope you found my stories of interest. Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.